Since the dawn of consciousness, a shadow has stretched across the soul of humanity, long, silent, and unyielding. It is the fear of death, that ancient spectre which whispers in the quiet hours and lingers in the rituals of the living and the tombs of the dead. From the pyramids of Egypt, where pharaohs were entombed with golden treasures to appease the gods of the afterlife, to the mist-laden hills of Tibet, where monks meditate upon the Bardo Thodol, the Book of the Dead, this dread has shaped civilizations, birthed religions, and carved itself into the very bedrock of human thought. In the flickering torchlight of prehistoric caves, early humans painted visions of the hunt and the spirit world, their hands trembling not only from the cold, but from the unspoken terror of what lay beyond the final breath. The Greeks, in their grandeur, wove tales of Hades and the river Styx, where Charon ferried souls into the unknown, while the Aztecs offered blood and jade to a sun that demanded sacrifice, lest the world itself perish. Even now, in an age of science and reason, the fear persists, disguised as existential angst, manifesting in midnight ponderings over the fragility of life. Hospitals hum with the quiet desperation of those clinging to fleeting moments, and philosophers still debate whether death is an end or merely a transition cloaked in mystery. Yet what if this fear, this primal, universal dread, were not an inevitability, but an illusion? What if the key to unlocking its grip lay not in denial, nor in blind faith, but in a wisdom so profound it could only emerge from the depths of the unconscious? Here, in the quiet annals of the early 20th century, a man would bridge the seen and the unseen, offering answers that defied logic yet resonated with the soul. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, would speak from the threshold between worlds, his voice a whisper from the other side. His revelations did not dismiss the fear of death, they transcended it. He would tell of a life that does not end, but transforms, of a consciousness that is not extinguished, but liberated. In doing so, he would challenge everything humanity believed about the final frontier. But to understand how, one must first journey into the heart of the fear itself, and ask, what if death is not the enemy, but the greatest teacher we have yet to embrace? In the quiet hum of late 19th century Kentucky, where the veil between the seen and the unseen seemed thinner, a child was born who would one day bridge the two worlds in ways both profound and perplexing. Edgar Cayce entered this earthly realm on March 18, 1877, in the modest farmlands near Beverly, a place where the rhythms of nature dictated life's pace and the Bible was both law and solace. His childhood was unremarkable in its simplicity, yet beneath the surface, something extraordinary stirred. As a boy he spoke of visions, of invisible friends who whispered wisdom beyond his years, and of a peculiar ability to absorb knowledge simply by resting his head upon his schoolbooks. These were not mere flights of fancy, but the first flickers of a gift that would later earn him the title of the sleeping prophet. A man who, in the depths of trance, could traverse the landscapes of the soul and return with revelations that defied explanation. The turning point arrived in 1901, when Cayce, then a struggling photographer plagued by a mysterious ailment that robbed him of his voice, sought hypnosis as a last resort. Under its influence, he did not merely describe his own condition, he diagnosed it with eerie precision, prescribing a cure that restored his speech within days. But the revelation did not end there. In that altered state, he began to speak of others, strangers whose names and afflictions he could not possibly have known. Word spread like wildfire through the small town of Hopkinsville, where skeptics and seekers alike gathered to witness the phenomenon. Some called it divine intervention, others, a parlor trick of the mind. Yet those who sat before him, hearing their deepest ailments, physical, emotional, even karmic, laid bare in his soft rhythmic cadence, knew they were in the presence of something ancient, something sacred. What unfolded in those early readings was not mere clairvoyance, but a tapestry of spiritual insight woven from threads of past lives, Akashic records, and the eternal nature of the soul. Cayce spoke of Atlantis as though he had walked its streets, described the healing properties of herbs with the authority of a forgotten sage, and mapped the journey of the soul after death with the clarity of a cartographer charting known lands. His words carried the weight of something remembered rather than revealed, as if he were not the source, but merely the vessel. And yet the man himself remained humble, a devout Christian, a family man, a photographer by trade, never seeking the limelight, though it found him nonetheless. One must pause here and consider the nature of such a figure. Prophets, in their many forms across time, have rarely been the firebrand preachers of popular imagination. More often, they are the quiet ones, the reluctant oracles who bear the weight of knowledge, not for glory, but because the truth demands a voice. Cayce's emergence in the early 20th century was no accident. It was a convergence of an era hungry for meaning beyond materialism, and a soul prepared to deliver it. His readings, now numbering in the thousands, stand as a testament to a simple yet radical idea that death is not an end, but a transition, as natural as the changing of seasons, and no more to be feared than the setting sun. So let this question linger as the dust of history settles around his story. What does it mean to be a bridge between worlds? And if one man, with no formal training, could access such depths of wisdom, what might it reveal about the latent capacities within us all? Perhaps the fear of death is not a sentence, but an invitation to look deeper, to listen closer, and to trust that the soul's journey is far vaster than the boundaries of a single lifetime. In the quiet chambers of his trance-induced revelations, Edgar Cayce did not merely speak of death as an end, but as a transition so natural, so intrinsic to the soul's journey, that its fear dissolved beneath the weight of his words. His readings, meticulously documented across thousands of sessions, painted the afterlife not as a void of uncertainty, but as a continuum of consciousness, where the spirit sheds only the temporary vessel of the body to step into a realm of greater clarity. Death is but passing from one room to another, he once declared in a reading for a grieving widow, yet with the same memories, the same loves, the same desires, only purified, only made more real. Here in the simplicity of his analogy lay the radical shift. Death was not annihilation, but awakening. Society, however, has long clung to a different narrative, one steeped in finality and dread. The modern world treats death as the ultimate thief, stripping away identity, relationships, and purpose in a single irreversible act. Hospitals become battlegrounds against the inevitable, obituaries stark reminders of loss. Yet Cayce's teachings confronted this fear with an unshakable certainty, rooted in ancient wisdom. He spoke of the Akashic records, an eternal ledger of the soul's experiences, where every life, every lesson, every love is preserved beyond the physical. In reading 262 Midas 54, he described the moment of transition as the opening of the book of life's experiences, where the entity meets itself, its higher self, and reviews that which has been accomplished. There is no judgment here, no punishment, only the gentle unfolding of truth, the soul's own reckoning with its growth. What, then, becomes of fear when death is redefined, not as an ending, but as a homecoming? Cayce's insights suggest that the terror we associate with mortality is, at its core, a resistance to the unknown, a resistance born of forgetfulness. For the soul, he insisted, there is no unknown. It has walked this path before, in cycles of return and renewal, each life a thread in an endless tapestry. The fear dissolves not through denial, but through remembrance. The body is the temple of the living God, he reminded his listeners, and as such, it is not to be feared in its passing, but revered in its purpose. Now consider this. If death is but a doorway, what might lie beyond it for you? And if the soul's journey is indeed eternal, how might that knowledge reshape the way you live, not in the shadow of fear, but in the light of continuity? The answers, Cayce would say, are not hidden in the future, but whispered in the quiet chambers of the present, where the soul already knows the way. And yet, if one were to peer beyond the veil of mortality, through the lens of Edgar Cayce's readings, a far grander tapestry unfolds, one in which death is not an end, but a transition within an eternal cycle. Here the concept of reincarnation emerges not as mere philosophical speculation, but as a living truth woven into the fabric of the soul's evolution. Cayce's revelations, spanning thousands of life readings, depict existence as a series of interconnected journeys, each lifetime a classroom where the spirit refines its wisdom, corrects its errors, and expands its capacity for love. Consider, for a moment, the case of a soul who in one incarnation was a healer in ancient Egypt, only to return centuries later as a physician in the modern era, its hands still guided by the same unseen force, its purpose echoing across time. Or the individual who, burdened by unresolved greed in a past life, finds themselves in circumstances that demand selflessness, as if the universe itself had designed a curriculum for their growth. Cayce's readings suggest that these are not random occurrences, but deliberate steps in a divine pedagogy. Life then becomes less a singular performance and more a symphony, each movement building upon the last, each note resonating with the lessons of what came before. This perspective dismantles the terror of death by revealing it as a mere threshold. If the soul is eternal, then what we call death is but a brief pause, a moment of reflection in the spiritual realm before the next chapter begins. The fear that once gripped the heart dissolves when one realizes that relationships, talents, and even unresolved conflicts may re-emerge in future lives, offering another chance to heal, to create, to fulfill what was left undone. Cayce often spoke of soul groups, clusters of spirits who reincarnate together across lifetimes, playing different roles for one another's growth. Could it be that the stranger who challenges you today was once a beloved teacher in another time? Or that the child you guide now may have been your guide in a life long forgotten? Such revelations demand a profound shift in how one engages with the present. If this life is but one act in an endless play, then every choice, every kindness, every cruelty, every moment of courage or cowardice ripples far beyond the immediate. The fear of death then is revealed as a distraction, a shadow cast by the ego's illusion of finality. But what if, instead of dreading the end, one began to ask, what am I here to learn? How might this struggle serve my soul's long journey? And if I knew I would return, what would I dare to create today? Let these questions linger, for in the silence that follows, the voice of the eternal self begins to whisper, and the fear that once seemed so vast may yet dissolve into the quiet certainty of a journey without end. The alchemy of fear. How spiritual growth dissolves the shadow of death, and so we arrive at the threshold of a deeper revelation, one that Edgar Cayce did not merely speak of, but lived as a sacred truth. For him the fear of death was never an inevitability, but a signal, a whisper from the soul urging the seeker toward higher ground. His readings, spanning decades and thousands of lives, consistently returned to a singular insight. The fear of death is not a flaw of human nature, but a symptom of spiritual stagnation. To transcend it was not to deny mortality, but to awaken to the eternal within the temporal. History offers us a poignant mirror. Consider the ancient Essenes, whose scrolls Cayce often referenced in his trance states. These mystics of the Judean desert did not fear death because they had mastered the art of dying daily, not in a literal sense, but through relentless self-examination and communion with the divine. Their lives were a preparation, a refining of the spirit so that when the physical vessel fell away, the transition was as natural as dawn following night. Cayce echoed this philosophy, insisting that spiritual growth is the antidote to the paralysis of fear. When one cultivates the inner life through meditation, service, and the pursuit of one's sole purpose, the specter of death loses its power. It becomes not an end, but a passage known and welcomed. Yet how does one begin this alchemy? Cayce's prescriptions were precise though never rigid. He spoke of meditation not as an escape, but as a rehearsal for eternity, a practice where the mind quietens long enough to remember its origin. In his own life he demonstrated this discipline, often entering his trance states with a simple prayer, "We are through with self, thou art the way." This surrender, he taught, was the first step toward dissolving fear. Self-reflection followed, not as navel-gazing, but as an excavation of the soul's contracts, those unfulfilled promises to the self that breed regret, and by extension dread of the unknown. And finally there was purpose. Cayce's readings revealed, time and again, that those who lived in alignment with their soul's mission, whether as healers, teachers, or quiet way showers, faced death with a serene certainty. Their lives were not measured in years, but in the depth of their contribution to the great tapestry of consciousness. But let us not mistake this for passive acceptance. Cayce's vision was radical in its empowerment. He foretold of a time when humanity would no longer see death as a thief, but as a collaborator, a force that shapes the urgency and beauty of life. The fear that once clung like a shadow could be transmuted into fuel, propelling the seeker toward greater love, wisdom, and service. And so the question lingers, suspended in the space between what is known and what is yet to be discovered. What if the fear you carry is not a burden, but a compass, pointing you toward the growth your soul has been waiting to claim? Perhaps the hour has come to lay down the weight of that fear, and to step, at last, into the light of your own becoming. The hidden web of souls, Edgar Cayce, and the eternal bonds that transcend death. Long before the first breath is drawn into mortal lungs, the soul is already woven into a tapestry far grander than the fleeting years of earthly existence. Edgar Cayce, in his profound trance revelations, spoke of soul groups, clusters of spirits bound not by chance, but by divine design, drawn together across lifetimes to fulfill shared purposes, to teach and to learn, to love and to challenge. These are not mere companions of circumstance, but eternal kin, their connections stretching beyond the veil of death into the infinite corridors of the Akashic records. To understand them is to glimpse the architecture of the universe itself, a living, breathing network, where no soul is ever truly alone. Cayce described these groups as families of the spirit, gathered in the heavenly realms before incarnation, agreeing to play their parts in the earthly drama. A mother in this life may have been a rival in another, a friend now might once have been a teacher, and a stranger could carry the soul of one who vowed to guide you through darkness. The conflicts, the affections, the inexplicable recognitions, these are not accidents, but sacred contracts. When viewed through this lens, death loses its sting, for it becomes not an end, but a transition within an unbroken cycle. The bonds do not sever, they simply shift form. The love, the lessons, the unresolved threads all endure, waiting to be rekindled in another time, another place. Consider then the faces that haunt your memory, not with sorrow, but with significance. That grandparent whose wisdom felt older than their years, the child who seemed to know you before you spoke, the adversary who forced you to grow in ways you never imagined. Cayce urged his seekers to reflect, who are the souls that have shaped you, and more profoundly, what did you agree to learn from them? The fear of death dissolves when one realizes that these relationships are not confined to a single lifetime. They are eternal covenants, and every farewell is but a pause in a conversation that spans eternity. Let this truth settle into the quiet chambers of your heart. If the soul is immortal, then love, too, is immortal. And if love cannot be destroyed by death, then what is there left to fear? The next time you gaze into the eyes of another, ask yourself, is this a soul I have known before? The answer may come not in words, but in the deep, wordless recognition that you are never separate, only ever returning to the arms of those who have walked with you since the beginning. The alchemy of everyday eternity, Cayce's blueprint for a fearless life. And so the question lingers, not as a whisper of dread, but as an invitation. How does one walk this earth, bound by time, yet untouched by the shadow of its end? Edgar Cayce did not merely speak of death as a distant threshold. He revealed it as a living principle, woven into the fabric of each moment. To dissolve its terror is not to deny its presence, but to recognize that life, in its truest essence, is not a countdown, it is a spiral. And upon this spiral, every act of awareness becomes a step toward the infinite. Consider, then, the practical alchemy Cayce offered, the transmutation of fear into purpose. He spoke of compassion as the first sacred tool, a force that dissolves the illusion of separation. When one extends kindness without expectation, they touch the eternal thread that binds all souls. It is no accident that those who devote themselves to service often speak of a quiet certainty, as though death's sting has been dulled by the warmth of connection. Cayce's readings suggest this is no coincidence, but a law. Love, in its purest form, is the language of the soul's immortality. To cultivate it, is to build a bridge between this life and the next, rendering the crossing less a leap into darkness and more a return to a long-forgotten home. Yet compassion alone is not enough. Knowledge too must be pursued, not as mere information, but as gnosis, the kind of wisdom that alters the lens through which one perceives existence. Cayce urged the study of ancient truths, the contemplation of dreams, and the examination of synchronicities, for these are the fingerprints of the divine upon the mundane. When one seeks understanding with humility, the universe responds in kind, revealing patterns that suggest a grander design. The fear of death withers in the light of such revelation, for what is terror but the child of ignorance? And then there are the rituals, the daily sacraments of the spirit. Meditation, Cayce insisted, is not an escape but an alignment, a tuning of the inner self to the frequencies of eternity. Prayer, when stripped of dogma, becomes a conversation with the part of oneself that has always been and will always be. Even the act of stillness, of sitting with the silence between heartbeats, can become a practice in recognizing the timeless within the temporal. These are not abstract ideals, but actions, tangible and immediate. To engage in them is to rehearse for the ultimate transition, not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of a traveler who has studied the map. Yet perhaps the most radical of Cayce's teachings is this: live as though you have already died, not in resignation, but in liberation. When one sheds the weight of finite concerns, the petty grievances, the clinging to possessions, the desperate need for legacy, they begin to move through the world with the grace of a being who knows themselves to be more than their body. This is not moroseness, but the opposite, a vibrant, almost playful detachment, the kind that allows one to savor a sunset or a lover's touch with the full awareness that these too are echoes of eternity. So let the question linger, no longer as a spectre, but as a compass. What would it mean to greet each dawn, not as a step closer to the end, but as a deeper immersion into the endless? The answer lies not in the beyond, but in the breath you take this very moment, the one that carries within it the same life force that has animated saints and stardust alike. Cayce's vision was never about conquering death, but about remembering life in all its fragility, its beauty, its sacred ordinariness, as the ever-unfolding journey it was always meant to be. The illusions that bind us, what Cayce revealed about the afterlife's true nature, from the shadowed halls of ancient mystery schools to the whispered fears of modern minds. Humanity has long been haunted by a singular question: what awaits beyond the threshold of death? Yet, as Edgar Cayce revealed through his trance-induced visions, the terror that grips so many is not born of truth, but of misunderstanding. The misconceptions woven into cultural law, religious dogma, and even scientific skepticism have distorted the afterlife into a specter of dread rather than a natural continuation of the soul's journey. Whenever you consider for a moment the most pervasive illusion that death is an end. Cayce's readings, spanning thousands of cases, painted a far different portrait. He described the transition not as a cessation, but as an awakening, a shedding of the physical vessel, much like a serpent sloughs its skin. The soul, he insisted, does not vanish into oblivion, but steps into a realm of vibration, where thought and memory become the architecture of existence. Here, there is no punishment in the fire and brimstone sense, no eternal damnation as a cosmic verdict. Instead, Cayce spoke of self-confrontation, a mirror held to the soul, where one's earthly actions are reviewed, not with judgment, but with the clarity of hindsight. The suffering some fear is not inflicted by a wrathful deity, but arises from the soul's own resistance to its truths. Then there is the myth of permanent separation, the belief that death severs bonds irrevocably. Cayce's accounts tell of a spiritual continuum where love persists, unbroken by the veil. He described souls gathering in family groups between incarnations, reuniting with those who had crossed before them. The grief of loss, he explained, is a human experience, not a cosmic law. The departed are not gone, they are simply perceiving from a different octave of existence, one we cannot yet sense with our physical eyes. Yet perhaps the most paralyzing misconception is the idea that the afterlife is a static destination, a heaven of harps and clouds, or a hell of eternal torment. Cayce's visions revealed a dynamic, evolving spiritual plane where souls continue to learn, grow, and even prepare for future earthly sojourns. There are no idle angels, no frozen states of being. The afterlife, he taught, is as alive with purpose as the life we now live, only unshackled from the limitations of matter. So, one must ask, what if the fear of death is not a warning but a distortion? What if the stories that have shaped our dread were never meant to be taken literally, but as metaphors for a truth too vast for human language? Cayce's work invites us to peel back the layers of inherited belief, to question the narratives that have held us captive. For in the quiet spaces between fear and curiosity, a new understanding emerges, one where death is not the enemy, but the next great adventure of the soul. Let this be the moment you dare to reconsider. What if the afterlife is not something to fear, but a return to a state of being you have always on some level remembered? The choice to see beyond the illusions is yours, and with it the first step toward true liberation. And so one stands at the threshold of a question as ancient as consciousness itself. What if the fear of death is not an inevitability, but a choice? Edgar Cayce, in his profound trance states, did not merely speak of the afterlife as a distant abstraction. He described it as a living continuum, a breath between dimensions where the soul neither begins nor ends, but simply is. Yet how often does one pause to examine the weight of their own beliefs, the unseen chains that bind perception to dread? Consider for a moment the quiet spaces between thoughts, where the mind whispers its deepest apprehensions. What stories have been absorbed, unquestioned about the great transition? Were they inherited from generations who also trembled before the unknown? Or were they forged in moments of personal loss, when grief painted the beyond in shades of finality? Cayce's readings suggest that fear is not a natural state of the soul, but a construct of the unremembered self, the part of us that has forgotten its own eternity. He spoke of life as a classroom, where each experience, no matter how fleeting, is a lesson in preparation for what follows. But preparation requires more than passive acceptance. It demands an active unraveling of the myths we have woven around mortality. Let one ask, how has the spectre of death shaped the choices you have made? Has it urged you toward safety at the cost of passion, or silenced questions that burned too brightly? The records of Cayce's work reveal that those who confronted their fear, not with resistance but with curiosity, often found it dissolving like mist under the sun. They discovered that death, when stripped of its cultural masks, is not an adversary, but a companion, a silent witness to the soul's evolution. To embrace Cayce's teachings is to engage in an act of radical trust, not in dogma, but in the quiet knowing that existence is far vaster than the boundaries of a single lifetime. It is to recognize that the energy which animates the body does not vanish but transforms, as a river does not cease when it meets the ocean. And so an invitation lingers in the air. Close your eyes and envision the moments when fear has dictated your path. Now imagine releasing that grip. What would you dare to feel, to pursue, to become? The shift is not in the dying but in the living, the way one carries the awareness of continuity into each breath, each decision, each act of love. For if death is but a doorway, then fear is the shadow cast by a mind that has not yet turned to face the light beyond it. And that light, Cayce assured, is not a distant promise. It is the very essence from which you have always been woven. And so the journey through the revelations of Edgar Cayce draws to its natural close, yet not as an ending, but as the quiet unfolding of a threshold. For what is death, if not the most profound of transitions, a passage not into oblivion, but into the luminous continuity of the soul? Cayce, in his trance-bound wisdom, did not merely speak of death as an event to be endured, but as a sacred return, a homecoming to the realms from which consciousness first emerged. The fear that clings to mortal thought is but a shadow cast by the illusion of separation, a misplaced belief that existence could ever be confined to the boundaries of flesh. Yet his readings whisper otherwise, that life and what follows are but two movements of the same eternal dance, each step choreographed by the hand of a divine intelligence that remembers no beginning and fears no end. To live without the fear of death, then, is not to deny its reality, but but to recognize its place within the grander tapestry of the soul's evolution. Cayce's visions spoke of cycles, not of finality, but of renewal, not of loss, but of expansion. The records of the Akashic fields, as he described them, hold no judgment for the transitioning spirit, only the gentle accounting of lessons learned and those yet to be embraced. The body may dissolve like morning mist, but the essence, that which loved, questioned, and yearned, persists, carried forward on the breath of the infinite. And if this is true, then what remains to fear? The dissolution of form, or is it rather the fear of having never truly lived? Let this be the invitation, then, to step into the remaining days not as one counting the hours, but as one who has glimpsed the horizon and chosen to walk toward it with open hands. Cayce's teachings do not ask for blind faith, but for an experiment in trust. Trust that the universe is not a cold, indifferent void, but a living cradle of becoming. Begin small. When anxiety tightens its grip, pause and ask, what would it mean to treat this moment as sacred, as if it were both the first and the last? Observe how the fear recedes when the soul remembers its own immortality. Keep a record of the synchronicities that follow, the whispers of guidance that arrive unbidden, the sudden clarity that dawns when the mind surrenders its need for control. These are not coincidences, but echoes of the truth Cayce revealed, that death is not the enemy of life, but its most faithful companion, waiting only to remind us of what we have always known. The challenge now is to live in such a way that death becomes not a specter, but a teacher, to see in every ending the promise of a new beginning, in every farewell the silent vow of reunion. The records of Cayce's readings are not sealed in the past. They breathe still, waiting for those who dare to test their truths against the anvil of experience. So let the question linger, not as a burden, but as a compass. If the soul cannot be destroyed, what would you attempt if you knew fear was the only illusion? The answer will not come in words, but in the quiet revolution of a heart that has learned to dance with eternity. And when the time arrives, as it must for all, to cross that final threshold, may it be met not with trembling, but with the serene certainty of one who has already begun to live on the other side.